Renewed talks on voting rights are underway on Capitol Hill, where the Senate is plotting new paths toward a potential legislative victory. Democrats argue protections are needed after many GOP-led states passed some of the most restrictive and aggressive voter suppression laws this country has seen in decades. Protests and rallies are planned for later this month as political clashes erupt between Democrats and Republicans in states like Georgia and Texas, where access to the polls has been targeted. This all comes as the U.S. marks the 56th anniversary of the historic Voting Rights Act. President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the bill into law on this day in 1965. The landmark legislation secured Black Americans' right to vote and banned discrimination at the polls. However, activists argue that those rights are being threatened. So for more on this, we want to bring in global human rights activist and chairman of the Drum Major Institute, Martin Luther King Jr. III. Thank you so much for joining us, Martin Luther King III. I really appreciate you joining us. You know, we had these two sort of ambitious landmark voting rights pieces of legislation that they've stalled, and it's kind of heartbreaking. What's your message to Congress and everyday Americans on this day after Senate Republicans blocked voting rights legislation in June, and as lawmakers really struggle to reach an agreement on this crucial issue?
Well, number one, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to share today. We have engaged with a number of organizations from March On to the National Action Network to SEIU and several others, over 100 partners now, to have demonstrations on August 28th in Washington and Atlanta and Phoenix and Miami and in Houston. And then there will be several sister city marches as well as over 30 activations, meaning in 30 places there will be some kind of demonstration saying that we want to expand the Voting Rights Act. We want to pass the John Lewis Voter Registration Restoration Act, which provides a pre-clearance provision so that states will not be able to just arbitrarily stop people from voting. And when I say stop, what I mean is putting restrictions in place to make it harder to vote. We should be expanding the right to vote, not retracting and reducing. And that is what we've seen in at least 18 states now, with over 400 pieces of legislation being passed. So we're saying to our senators, really, because Congress really has done what it needs to do, except for the John Lewis bill now needs to be passed, which will happen. So we want our senators to pass this bill so that there's some federal oversight where states may tend to go too far sometimes to keep people from voting. In 2021, we had a great election last year in terms of there was no fraud. There was almost nothing. And yet we have a former president who continues to say there was, and that creates a lot of confusion because he's lying to people and people don't want to accept the truth. But the reality is we are better than this. We must expand, not restrict and reduce.
But Mr. King, so what's your message to local Republican lawmakers trying to enact these voting restrictions in states like Texas and Florida, who argue their intentions are meant to strengthen our elections, not to suppress or discriminate against voters? What do you say to them?
So I'm not sure that one of the things is proposed, I think, in the current legislation. It has not passed, of course, because the Texas legislature and legislators on the Democratic side left the state, so they cannot be a quorum at this particular point. But one of the things is Harris County, the largest county in Houston, where you have a large Black and brown population. Hypothetically, if there were 100 boxes to drop ballots, now they're talking about one. That's a restriction. That's not an expansion. And so regardless of what they say, it's crystal clear as to what they're doing. And the only way you get, I think, action to change that is people must engage in a nonviolent way in the streets and say that this is unacceptable. This is not democracy. How do you talk about democracy all over the world, but yet you're trying to suppress democracy at home? And I don't think they'll say, what's the ID provision? People don't have a problem with ID, but when you have restrictive IDs and you are not able to get IDs to certain people, that becomes the problem. I mean, as I said, we're better than this. Why would we stop people from voting? Why would we not expand and make it so easy to vote that anyone can vote, not fraudulently, but easily? And we can do this because we did it last year.
Speaking of those Texas Democrats that fled the state, you joined them along with your wife and Reverend Al Sharpton, and you had meetings on Capitol Hill. You spoke to lawmakers about the urgency, the importance of these voting rights pieces of legislation. You didn't talk to everyone; didn't see eye to eye with you. What was the reaction? What was the response? Do you think you changed any minds?
I think I don't know that we changed any minds. We certainly met with Democrats and Republicans. We met with Senator Manchin first, and it was a very instructive meeting. He did say he supports the John Lewis Voter Registration Restoration Act. He thought he was going to be able to encourage at least 5 of his colleagues, he thought, on the other side to support it. He didn't know how much further it would go. We asked about a carve-out. I mean, we have a carve-out as it relates to as it relates to budget issues. We should have a similar carve-out as it relates to the most fundamental right that exists for us all, which is the right to vote. We felt he's not committed to that at this point. So I think we're going to have to wait and see. However, there were 8 members, including him, that afternoon who had met before we met with Senator Schumer, the majority leader. They had met, and I think they're working on something. And I think we're just going to have to wait and see. But I also think that we're continuing to do what we're doing. We're not going to give up and go away. Whether we are able to get this legislation at this point or not, I don't know. What I will say is in 1965, I can assure you that there was no certainty that the Voting Rights Act was going to pass, but it was what my father and others did in this country that made it imminent. And so I think we're in that same position today. I think the more people we get out in the streets, the more people we have calling our senators, the more people we have tweeting our senators, the better opportunity we'll have.
And what about the president, Mr. King, the president and Vice President Kamala Harris and the Biden administration? In your mind, are they doing enough to prioritize voting rights in this country? We all recall when President Biden delivered his victory speech, how he thanked African Americans across the country for delivering him that victory. What more would you like to see from them?
So I think the president came out and made a significant speech just a few days back around the issue of voting rights, instead where he is. In terms of whether he's doing enough, you never know all of the things that are going on behind the scenes. So I'm sure he's committed to it. He's committed to sign legislation if he can get legislation. The question is, how do you get more Republican colleagues who work with him? The irony is that there are several colleagues in the Senate who voted for the Voting Rights Act restoration in 2006. So why are those colleagues not doing that now? We talked to Lindsey Graham, and he said he might be interested in some things or be able to do something around police reform, which is very good, but that he could not vote for the Voting Rights Act, and which is hard to understand. What has changed in terms of those years that now you cannot support it? But I think that, again, people in South Carolina need to hear, Lindsey Graham needs to hear from his constituents. And this is part of what we're trying to do, in addition to registering over 2 million people between now and the midterm elections as it relates to these demonstrations. We're going to continue to have activism, engagement, and ultimately, I believe we can get a victory, ultimately.
You and other civil rights activists will be holding a march for voting rights in several cities, including Washington, later on this month on the 28th. What's your main goal?
The main goal is to dramatize and say to Congress, really specifically the Senate in this case, that we want to expand voting rights. We do not want, and we want federal government oversight, which is a pre-clearance provision that is in the John Lewis Voter Registration Restoration Act. And that particular bill, we want that bill passed. And we, as I said, we want to expand voting rights. States are choosing to restrict voting rights, and that is problematic. And that's why we are calling on our federal government to really make democracy real for all people and not exclude people from the process or minimize the opportunity for people to participate. That is a fundamental message. But as I said, we also have a goal of registering over 2 million people between now and the midterm elections. We also will have people calling senators. We're going to have people reaching out to senators in all the technology modalities. As I say, we have the potential, we believe, to see some kind of victory around the issue of expanding voting rights.
Martin Luther King III, thank you, sir, for spending some time with us this morning. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity.